Yeah, Biden's speech was it was competent, and given how many gaffes we saw on the campaign trail, it was maybe much better than it might have
It
been.
was no doubt a return to a tone of statesmanship.
It was a return, yes, to the high production values of the blue team, but also, I would say, the degree to which unity was invoked so regularly and has been so weaponized since the election. I just find it kind of appalling, the abuse of that term, and I can't help but take it a little bit personally.
So that said, he shut down DAPL, which, very good job. He re-entered the U.S. on the Paris Climate Accord. Awesome. Very, very nice. He reestablished ties with the WHO, the World Health Organization. Utterly necessary, even for those of us who have been skeptical about some of the politicization that the WHO has engaged in. And he signed this executive order on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Cool. Wait. Not cool. Not cool.
Yeah.
Not.
Well,
let's just read the first paragraph.
Good.
Okay. Zach, you can show my screen. Oops. This is an executive order from the day of the inauguration, January 20th, on, as I said, preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. Excuse me, by the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered as follows. Section 1, policy. Every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, no matter who they are or whom they love. Children should be able to learn without worrying about whether they will be denied access to the restroom, the locker room, or school sports. Adults should be able to earn a living and pursue a vocation, knowing that they will not be fired, demoted, or mistreated because of whom they go home to or because how they dress does not conform to sex-based stereotypes. People should be able to access health care and secure a roof over their heads without being subjected to sex discrimination. All persons should receive equal treatment under the law, no matter their gender identity or sexual orientation. That first, Zach, if I may, thank you. That first sentence, even just the first two phrases of the first sentence of this executive order, every person should be treated with respect and dignity and should be able to live without fear, is a completely honorable sentiment and exactly not what this executive order then proceeds to do. What it proceeds to do is prioritizes the demands of a very, very tiny minority of people over the rights, the established legal rights of half of the population. Since when is this what democracy looks like?
Well, the problem, of course, is that you can read that in two different ways. And it is, in fact, I would argue, designed so that we will read it in two different ways, that it is a signal to those who are looking for a particular change in the law while appearing to subscribe to values that all decent Americans hold. And the problem is that there is an actually difficult balance that needs to be struck between providing people the liberty to do things like transition to the gender that they feel, while protecting people who have a right to be protected, which is to say, women. And so these things, it is not clear how to strike that balance, and it is certainly not going to be a simple matter. But in doing it this way, they have effectively chosen sides while leaving the option to declare themselves completely concordant with the values that we all share.
Yeah, the rest of the executive order, with one notable sentence, is pretty anodyne, right? It's fairly generic, and exactly as you say, it leaves them open to declare later, oh, that's not what we meant. Oh, we didn't see this eventuality coming. We couldn't have seen what was downstream of this. And, of course they can.
Right. It's perfectly clear that in effectively extending rights to trans women, these are people who are born male, who transition to female, that they are encroaching on the rights of women to be protected from men in things like sports competition and, more importantly, in cases like when they are sent to prison.
Prisons, crisis centers, halfway houses, places that are single sex for the explicit reason that women are a protected class. And this has never before been a class to which you could simply declare yourself, I am now in that. And the vast majority of what I will continue to call the truly trans people, and no, I don't have a magic eyesight with which to determine at first glance, who that is. But I will say that the truly trans people represent, I am certain, a small fraction of the people who are currently masquerading as trans. And, we of course want to protect the rights and the health and the safety of truly trans people, but doing so in a way that is easily gameable and will be gamed and allows those many people who are interested in cosplay to come into women's spaces is frankly horrific. And I don't understand how anyone who has claimed to be interested in women's rights or protections for women or a feminist or any of this, I don't see how anyone, and I am sure that Biden and Harris both identify with those sorts of identifiers, can be in favor of this if they have thought even 2 steps down the road.
Well, I don't even think they are in favor of it. I think they are playing politics, and there is a large segment of the population that can't track multiple competing values simultaneously. And so there's a script that basically says, if you're a good person, you're in favor of protecting trans people. And I would agree with that. But protecting trans people, if that's all you see at that moment, at whose expense? And just to make this perfectly clear, why are women a protected class, and why does that protection need to be maintained, especially in light of all of the gains that women have made? Well, let me explain it this way.
I liked how that went.
Yeah, I'm just having a little conversation with myself. If you want to get some coffee or something, you're welcome.
For you, maybe.
Sure, that'd be great. But let's think about it this way. At a basic biological level, right? Nature has been balanced in some ways, but it has been unfair to women in the sense of rendering them vulnerable. There's the obvious fact of males on average being bigger, but there is the slightly harder to grapple with fact of the sexual asymmetry between men and women, which is to say, men are in a much better position physiologically to rape women than women are to rape men. Right. A woman raping a man is a difficult thing for her to accomplish, even if that's what she is desiring to do. And
the advantages that bad men will take of women are well understood, well named. Everyone is familiar with them. And they are universally understood by all but the reprehensible few to be appalling and disgusting. The power that bad women have over men is less well understood, has fewer names associated with it, and it is not nearly as likely to end in violence or unwanted pregnancy, for instance.
Yes, and men, they may not always resist bad women as they should, but they at least have that power at their disposal, whereas a man can overpower a woman, rape her, and as you point out, where I was going to go next, is the simple ability to potentially inflict a child on someone, right? That is a biological asymmetry. Now, it's reduced for people who might avail themselves of, family planning technology, but nonetheless, the ability of, this asymmetry between what a man can do to a woman and what a woman could do to a man is justification in and of itself for protected spaces where women don't have to worry about people with male genitals and gonads. And the idea that we are somehow, in an effort to be good to a small number of people who are involved in a gender transition, that we are going to open a loophole, well, no man would exploit that. Really? An unscrupulous man wouldn't choose?
Yeah. You don't even need to go to, have you met men? Have you met people? Of course people will. Meerkats would. Right. Giraffes would. This is what social organisms do. Some number of individuals in any social system, be they humans or dolphins or rabbits, will game the system and create a system that is gameable by executive order, and you're going to get a lot more of it.
Right. And, an executive order like this, well, if it doesn't draw it ought to protect women in sport, right? Let's
Yeah.
just agree that that would be the right thing to do because there are major physiological differences that advantage people born male.
Yeah.
But if your executive order doesn't recognize that there's a problem when it comes to prisons, and that a man sent to a men's prison for a sexual offense who suddenly decides that he's trans and prefers to be in a women's prison cannot be humored. And in fact, there are multiple examples of men who have done this and then gone on to assault women. So
now it does. The actual manifestation seems to be mostly at head of agencies, so federal agencies, and I do feel like it opens up a whole lot of possibility for downstream, but I'm not sure. For instance, what the effect of this executive order specifically would be on federal prisons. Obviously, on private prisons, it has no direct effect. I'm not sure about federal prisons because they're not agency level.
Well, I'm not sure actually that there's a distinction between the private and the publicly funded prisons, because the question is the rights of the prisoners. They're sentenced in a public context, and so it doesn't say that the executive order has an effect on prisons, but it signals a belief in a principle that obviously is insufficient to deal with the situation. And so are they going to reverse course on this and say, yes, this is true, equal protection, except when it comes to prisons? No, that's not very likely.
It's not very likely. And so they're effectively asking the populace to buy into a fiction. And the more fictions that people buy into, the more of that cognitive dissonance that all of us are asked to participate in, the more fractured our cognition gets, the less capable we are of having a coherent worldview and building it from first principles. And you're more likely, once you've accepted some number of these just lies about what reality is, you are more and more likely to say, whatever, I accept it. I'm going to go along with it because you appear to be feeding me something that's consistent in your worldview, and I don't know how to make sense of it.
Yeah. So, we've seen a number of these signals about direction, and we've seen them all delivered in Rorschach form. And I think, actually, I don't know if this is the place to introduce it, but I did a discussion with James Lindsay and Jesse Singal, and there's a segment of it that keeps coming back up, and Jesse has expressed frustration that he keeps being drawn back into discussions of it, and I don't wish to draw him back into a discussion.
Okay, so could we just? So there's a more natural place to go there, I think.
Perfect.
Can we do the next thing first? If you were going where I think you are, there's one more sentence in the executive order that I wanted to bring up, which is, and you don't have to show my screen, Zach. It is, for example, transgender Black Americans face unconscionably high levels of workplace discrimination, homelessness, and violence, including fatal violence. Now, early in the summer, when the protests and then the riots were beginning to become regular parts of life in Portland and many other cities around the U.S. and even the world, we pointed out here on this podcast that there was, at that point, on the Black Lives Matter homepage, a strange focus on what we suggested was a strange but unusual, notable focus on Black trans lives. Black trans lives matter. In fact, there was an organized rally for Black
major demonstration, the second major one in New York.
Yeah, so Black trans lives. What is it about Black trans? Like, why this intersectionality in particular? And there's a lot to do there, and I'm not sure this is where we want to explore that again, but unconscionably high levels of workplace discrimination, homelessness, and violence is the claim. Well, unconscionably high levels is, of course, a wiggle term that you could claim unconscionably high levels is any levels.
Yep.
And therefore, any violence against, pick your group, fill in your group here, is unconscionably high, in which case this sentence means nothing, in which case, why include it? And what they seem to be doing is signaling that they are making some kind of a statistical argument without actually having done so. So they provided cover for themselves, as you would, if you had no data. I really want to see the references. I am so tired of seeing this claim. Black trans lives are the ones who are the most threatened. There is an epidemic. And, there are 400,000 deaths in America that have been attributed to COVID at this point. And I didn't pull up the numbers, but something in the dozens at the most of trans people murdered in the U.S. last year, which is, the thing that is evidence of the epidemic of violence and hatred against trans lives, and often specifically Black trans lives. And, that many lives taken inappropriately, terribly, etc., does not a pandemic make. No, it does not. It makes you wonder who is served, right? Like who wins with this kind of rhetoric. And here's where I think we can segue to what you were going to talk about here. So Andy Ngo, our friend, also someone who we'll talk about a little bit later with regard to the Powell's dust up, who is a Portland-based, or was in Portland for his whole life, based journalist who focuses on revealing what Antifa is actually up to, and of course has drawn the ire of them many, many times, in sometimes public ways. A couple of years ago, revealed the fabrications behind the then ubiquitous claims, it seemed, that there was widespread street violence against trans people in Portland and Seattle. And I remember following this at the time. I think it was 2018, but actually Katie Herzog and Jesse Singal in their podcast Blocked and Reported were talking about this week. And they were talking about the good work that Andy Ngo did specifically on revealing that there was a clear financial incentive for such people to claim that they had been assaulted, because in almost every case, there was an immediate GoFundMe set up with several $1,000s accruing pretty rapidly to the person who had supposedly been assaulted, and there was a complete lack of evidence. There were never any police reports, and of course people hide behind, all cops are bastards, all of this, but no evidence, financial incentive. Gee, I wonder if this is perhaps an epidemic of violence against trans people on the streets of two of the most progressive cities in the country, that is actually a fiction. And Andy certainly found evidence to suggest that is likely. What it serves also to do, though, is not just enrich the individuals who are making those claims by lining their pockets with GoFundMe money, but it also further creates this culture of fear and anger, which allows, blue team and red team to go farther and farther apart and look suspiciously at each other, sometimes armed, from ever greater divides.
Yes, and at some level, the category is unassailable, right? Why is it that Black trans lives are somehow at the top of the stack? Well, this comes from intersectionality, the idea that there is some sort of emergent nature to the overlapping oppressions that someone experiences, that, the oppression of, a Black gay person is more than the sum of the oppression of Black and gay. And no doubt there's some truth to that, but you can't base policy on that. And what's more, you can't open a loophole based on it and expect nobody to cynically go through it, right? Mm-hmm. So, at some level, policy has to be colorblind, right? It is the blindness of the law that is its genius. And all of these things that say, actually, we can do better than blind. We can enhance it to protect this group and that group and the other group. All of these things are an invitation to gaming, except in cases where, as we discussed at the top here, these things are objective, right? I am female, therefore certain things inherently follow. And so anyway, we just got to stop being stupid about this. If you open a loophole, there will be people who use it to game the system, and the law has to be robust to that. It has to not allow it. Okay, and the last thing I would say, though, is that this brings us back around to what we started with, where we were talking about the indications out of the very young Biden administration. And we talked about several things that seemed positive: rejoining the WHO, the
Paris Climate Accord, shutting down the DAPL.
Yeah, and I would just say that in each of these two, I think we need to be cautious of the same kind of
the two being the WHO and the Paris Climate Accord.
Yes. So the WHO, in principle, should the U.S. be a very active member of the WHO? Sure, but there's a question about whether or not the WHO is so compromised by allegiances that, in fact, we are stuck in the position of effectively not having a viable WHO. And the fact of Peter Daszak being on the WHO's task force to determine the origin of SARS-CoV-2 in China is indicative of a deep kind of corruption, right? This is the last person who should be on that committee, and yet he's there. And
again, most positive gloss is, at the very least, there's a conflict of interest there.
There's a conflict of interest, and it may be driving. And so if that is the case, then the fact that symbolically it makes sense to participate in the world's mechanisms for navigating health issues and things like that is in conflict with what the hell are we going to do once the mechanisms are captured? We're going to have to do something unusual. With respect to the Paris Climate Accords, I would say, symbolically speaking, this is great. Of course, we should be party to global accords on managing resources like the atmosphere and protecting us from heat accumulation. On the other hand, it ain't a solution, right? It's more or less symbolic at the level of its effectiveness. And if we were ever going to get to something useful, we would have to have a very frank global discussion. And that would include figuring out, what parts of these models actually indicate something. How can you validate them rather than pretending that because the computer says that something's going to happen, that it is? What other data can we rely on in order to calibrate our belief or lack of belief in the models, etc.? So,
and we promote international efforts for actual alternative energy, et cetera.
Right. And with respect to DAPL, I would say I was very much not in favor of this pipeline. I don't like it, but
you protested against it.
Yeah, I did. But
back in whenever that was, like 2016.
2016, it would have been. But I want to know what the alternative is, and I want a net analysis. Right? The idea of we're not going to do this because our constituents don't like it is not good enough. The answer is, well, what are we going to do? And, so I'm not interested in the shell game where we pay attention to the symbolism over here and we don't check out the net effect of the policy change. So in all of these cases, I would say I remain to be convinced, and we have to move beyond symbolism and, political corruption and regulatory capture are two of the biggest stories of our era, and we're going to have to find our way out of the very deep hole they've dug for us.